I think the Copenhagen Accord was a significant step forward. It, for the first time, encompasses both developed and developing countries with annexes listing developed country commitments and developing country actions. So I think the main challenge going forward is really to try to figure out how to operationalize the Copenhagen Accord, how to address the aspects of it that need some further elaboration. So I think the two main areas here are, first of all, making good on the commitment by developed countries to provide both short-term financing and longer-term financing. There were significant financial pledges made by developed countries to provide financing to developing countries. So we need to figure out the sources of that money, the institutional arrangements for deciding who's going to get the money, through what channels it's going to flow. So and that's both for the shorter-term finance and also for the longer-term finance. So the Copenhagen Accord is a first step in trying to provide the kind of money that developing countries are going to need to mitigate, reduce their emissions, but we need to figure out exactly how that's going to work. And then the other, I think, aspect of the Copenhagen Accord that's going to need further elaboration is the provisions on monitoring, review, and verification, MRV, as it's called. So the Copenhagen Accord provides for a process for consultation and assessment of developing country actions and for fuller-fledged review of developed country actions, but exactly what the modalities of that are, what the rules are, all of that needs to be fully fleshed out. So it seems to me that the Copenhagen Accord does represent, some people have been very critical of the Copenhagen Accord because it wasn't a legally binding agreement. In my view, it really wasn't politically realistic to expect a legally binding agreement at this stage in the climate negotiations. So it seems to me that the Copenhagen Accord was a significant step forward, but in order to really fulfill its promise, it needs to be fleshed out. Now, I think there was at first, just if I could elaborate on that a minute more, there was a lot of skepticism as to whether Copenhagen Accord would really take off, because there was a question as to whether developing countries would be willing to associate themselves with the Copenhagen Accord. But since it was adopted, ultimately I think something like 60 plus countries have agreed to have their names associated with the Copenhagen Accord. So I think it has now gathered significant support, but the question is how to flesh it out, how to operationalize it. I think the starting point is the shared interest of both developed and developing countries in addressing climate change. Developing countries are going to be the ones that are most impacted by climate change, so there's a very strong shared interest in trying to address the causes of climate change and try to develop better strategies for adapting to the effects of climate change. So I think there is a sort of a common shared interest. Now, I think over the course of the negotiations, there's been been a real sharp division of the parties, the countries involved into these two camps, the developed country camp and the developing country camp. And the Kyoto Protocol, in a sense, memorialized that by only having emission commitments for developed countries. So I think the challenge is to try to begin to move beyond that traditional dichotomy and focusing more on the shared interest of countries in addressing climate change. And I think one of the ways that can be done is by having more focus on finance, because developing countries are going to need assistance in order to be able to take action against climate change. So one of the things that I think was encouraging at Copenhagen was the really significant amounts of money that were put on the table. Now, the problem's been in the past that money's been pledged and there hasn't always been follow-through. So I think there's a credibility issue as to whether developed countries are really going to make good on the financial pledges that they made in Copenhagen. So I think what's going to be critical for trying to begin to build trust and developing a more positive negotiating dynamic is that there actually is some beginning of providing finance from developed to developing countries. I think I think the UNFCCC has accomplished a lot, but I think one of the maybe one of the weaknesses of it is that it's really commanded almost most of the attention. And I think actually moving forward, it's desirable to develop more of a portfolio of different approaches. So not focus solely on the UNFCCC, but to try to pursue climate change in a whole range of different multilateral institutions. So the Montreal Protocol parties, for example, in recent decisions have agreed to reduce sharper reductions in ozone-depleting substances that also are greenhouse gases. And in fact, some people have calculated that the decisions by the Montreal Protocol parties to accelerate the phase-out of certain ozone-depleting substances actually is going to have a bigger effect on climate change than the Kyoto Protocol. So there's proposals to further take action against HFCs, other greenhouse gases, that both are greenhouse gases and ozone-depleting substances, as a way of an alternative forum in which you could pursue the climate change agenda. Similarly, one of the main contributors to climate change in the shorter term is what's called black carbon, soot from various kinds of emissions. Now, there are a variety of proposals to try to focus in on black carbon in places like the International Maritime Organization, other international institutions. So again, rather than put all our eggs in one basket, rather than focus solely on the UNFCCC as the place in which to focus on mitigation, it seems to me it would be desirable to tackle climate change in a whole series of different multilateral institutions. Similarly, there's potential, I think, and there's been increasing focus on this, in trying to use the trade regime to encourage green investments. So I think we need to be thinking more broadly about dealing with climate change rather than only focus on the Framework Convention process, look at other institutions. Now, those are all areas where I think the other institutions can serve essentially a complementary role. So, not competing with the Framework Convention, but addressing issues that aren't addressed by the Framework Convention, like black carbon, or maybe addressing issues that are addressed in the Framework Convention, like HFCs, that might be easier to address in the Montreal Protocol process, because that's been less politically polarized forum. Now, in addition to those, I think there have been also proposals to develop either complements or substitute forums focused specifically on climate, like the G20 or the Major Emitters Forum, the so-called MEF, Major Economies Forum. And I think those have a role to play too, because I think one of the problems in the Framework Convention process is it's very difficult to get agreement on a complicated problem like climate change when you're negotiating with 190 plus countries. So trying to do the negotiations in a smaller setting with a smaller number of countries, I think, makes it easier to, it reduces the negotiating costs and makes it easier to reach agreement. So, yeah, I think I would agree with people who've suggested pursuing the climate negotiations not only in the Framework Convention process, but also in the MEF, also in the G20, possibly in other areas as well. So the question always has been, I don't think there's been that much disagreement that one can undertake negotiations on climate change in these other forums. The question's been, do you actually reach the agreement in the other forum, or do you bring it back into the Framework Convention and try to do adoption ultimately under the Framework Convention? And I think in an ideal world, bringing it back into the Framework Convention and adopting the agreement there would be best, because the Framework Convention has a certain global legitimacy, which would make it advantageous. I think the question that's been raised in Copenhagen is whether that really is doable, because the Framework Convention operates on a consensus rule, and that allows individual country or small group of countries to block an agreement, and that's what happened ultimately in Copenhagen. So while I think it would be ideal to be able to bring an agreement reached outside the Framework Convention back into the process, I think ultimately, if that doesn't prove possible, countries may need to consider using the alternative forum really as the place in which ultimately to try to reach agreement.